Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in Appalachian history. Comment on where you're watching from, because what we're about to explore together has spanned over a century without ever being fully understood. We're talking about 1903, a time when the mountains of North Carolina held secrets as deep as their misty valleys. This video is a work of fiction, inspired by folklore elements. Characters and events have been creatively adapted. Any resemblance to real people is purely coincidental. This story was created for entertainment purposes only. Asheville was a city that breathed contradictions. On one hand, elegant hotels welcomed tourists from the north seeking fresh air and majestic landscapes. On the other, isolated communities lived on the slopes of the Appalachians, maintaining traditions that dated back to the first settlers. The railroad had arrived a few decades earlier, but many places still seemed stuck in the previous century. Dirt roads turned into mud pits during the winter, and thick fog could cause a person to lose their way just a few meters from home. It was in this setting that Sisters Cordelia and Marguerite Ashford became known throughout the Buncombe County region. They lived on a secluded property, about 12 kilometers north of the city, in an area where houses were separated by dense forests, and the most common sound was the wind whistling through the pine trees. The Ashford property was at the end of a narrow path, surrounded by centuries-old oak trees that seemed like silent guardians. The twins had just turned 32 when the first rumors began to circulate. They were known for their singular beauty, hair as dark as night, and eyes that some described as disturbingly penetrating. They never married, which was already a cause for speculation at a time when single women of that age were viewed with suspicion. But they weren't just single, they were also extremely reserved, receiving visitors only on very rare occasions, and always keeping conversations brief, almost cold. What truly intrigued the locals was the origin of the sisters' fortune. The property had belonged to their parents, who died under unclear circumstances in the winter of 1898. No one knew exactly what they died of. The local doctor, Dr. Harrison Whitfield, signed the death certificates indicating fever, but never provided details. After a quick and discreet burial, the twins took over everything and lived in even greater seclusion. In the following months, merchants in the city noticed something curious. Cordelia and Marguerite began making unusual purchases, large quantities of quicklime, digging tools, heavy chains, and padlocks. When questioned, they gave vague answers about renovations to the property or farm needs. But there was no farm. They didn't raise animals, they didn't plant anything besides a small vegetable garden. They lived off the money left by their parents, the origin of which no one knew for sure. In April 1903, a traveling salesman named Thomas Brennan disappeared. He used to pass through Asheville selling fabrics, medicines, and household goods, visiting the more isolated properties. His route included the home of the Ashford sisters. Thomas was Irish with no family in the region, someone who could disappear without many noticing immediately. But he had an employer in Knoxville, Tennessee, who found it strange when his salesman didn't return on schedule. It took 5 weeks before anyone began searching for Thomas more insistently. The sheriff of Buncombe County, a man named Eugene Dalton, began discreet investigations. He spoke with merchants, innkeepers, and families who lived along the routes the salesman traveled. And that's how the Ashford sisters' names first surfaced in a suspicious context. A woman who lived about 3 kilometers from the twins' property recounted something unsettling. The last time she had seen Thomas Brennan, he was heading in that very direction, carrying his heavy bags of merchandise. It was late afternoon, and she advised him not to go any further, as night would fall before he reached any safe place. But Thomas insisted. He said he had an appointment which would be his last stop before returning to Knoxville. He was never seen again. Sheriff Dalton decided to visit the Ashford sisters. He brought along a young deputy, too eager for his own good. It was early June, and the heat was already beginning to weigh heavily on the mountains. When they arrived at the property, they were greeted with a chilly courtesy. The twins made them wait outside while they fetched lemonade. They didn't invite them in. Dalton asked directly about Thomas Brennan. The sisters exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance before Cordelia answered, yes, he had been there. He had sold some things, rested a little, and continued on his way before nightfall. They didn't know where he went afterward. Marguerite agreed with her sister's every word, as if they had rehearsed the answer. The deputy, impatient, asked if he could take a look around the property. The twins stiffened. Cordelia said that this would be trespassing, that there was no reason for suspicion. The sheriff, more experienced, sensed the tension and decided to back down. He had no search warrant, no evidence of any crime, only the disappearance of a man whose last known location was uncertain. But Eugene Dalton wasn't a fool. He knew how to recognize fear disguised as indignation. And there was something in those women's eyes, something that made him think of the old stories his grandmother told about mountain witches and dark pacts. Of course, he didn't believe in those things. He was a man of the law, practical and skeptical. But still, as he left that property, he felt a chill run down his spine. That night, back in town, the sheriff began reviewing old records. He wanted to know more about the Ashford family, about how they had acquired that land, about the twins' father's business dealings, and that's when he discovered the first loose thread of a much larger plot. Mr. Ashford, whose full name was Jonathan Ashford, had been accused of fraud in 1892, but the case never went to trial. Witnesses disappeared or changed their testimonies. The case died quietly in the court archives. And the more Eugene Dalton dug into that family's past, the more unanswered questions arose. Buncombe County records revealed a fragmented history full of convenient gaps. Jonathan Ashford had arrived in Asheville in 1875, coming from somewhere in Kentucky, although official documents never specified exactly where. He bought the isolated property with cash, which was already unusual for the time. Most settlers arrived with little and built slowly. Jonathan arrived wealthy. He quickly married a local woman named Elizabeth Garner, the daughter of a small merchant who died shortly after the wedding. Some said it was an accident during a hunt. Others whispered that old Garner simply drank himself to death. In 1871, the twins were born, Cordelia first, Marguerite 7 minutes later. Elizabeth never fully recovered from childbirth. She became a pale and silent figure, rarely seen in the city. Sheriff Dalton spoke with older people who remembered that time. A 70-year-old woman, who had worked as a seamstress and served several families in the region, told a revealing story. Elizabeth Ashford used to order dresses, but always with long sleeves and high collars, even in the scorching Appalachian summer. Once, during a fitting, the seamstress noticed marks on Elizabeth's wrist. They weren't from falls or common household accidents. They looked like old marks, fine scars that told a story of restraint. But the seamstress never asked. Back then, a family's affairs were their own business. Interfering could mean losing clients or worse. Jonathan Ashford had a reputation for being a temperamental man. Nobody wanted trouble with him. The twins grew up practically invisible. They didn't attend the city school, being educated at home by their mother when she was strong enough, or by tutors whom Jonathan hired and dismissed with alarming frequency. The few who worked for the family commented on the oppressive atmosphere of that house. Silences that were too long, meals eaten without conversation, the girls always obedient, always quiet, always observing. In 1898, Elizabeth died first. It was in February, during a snowstorm that isolated several properties for days. When the snow finally melted and the roads became passable again, Jonathan appeared in town with the news. His wife had died of a fever. She was already buried in the small cemetery on the property. Dr. Whitfield, who had barely examined her, signed the death certificate without asking any questions. 3 weeks later, Jonathan was also dead. Same alleged cause, same haste in the burial. The twins, now 27 years old, inherited everything. And it was from that moment that the real transformation began. They, who had always been submissive and quiet, assumed total control with a firmness that surprised everyone. They dismissed the few remaining employees. They closed the house to visitors. They started making those strange purchases that raised eyebrows in the city. Eugene Dalton spent days interviewing merchants. A blacksmith remembered selling heavy chains to the sisters, the kind used to tether large animals, but they didn't own any animals. A lumberjack recalled delivering thick planks and nails in sufficient quantity to build something substantial. When asked what it was for, Cordelia replied only that they were making necessary repairs. Repairs to what, she didn't say. The sheriff also discovered something disturbing in the local church records. The reverend kept baptisms, weddings and funerals in a meticulously maintained book. Jonathan and Elizabeth Ashford were recorded there, as was the baptism of the twins. But there was a strange note in the margin, made by the former reverend who had already passed away. It simply said, "May God protect these children from whatever dwells in that house." Nothing more, no explanation. Dalton showed the note to the current reverend, a man named Samuel Pritchard, who knew the families in the area well. Pritchard turned pale when he read it. He said that the former reverend was a serious man, not given to superstitions at all. If he had written something like that, he had his reasons, but what those reasons were, no one could ever know. Meanwhile, life in Asheville continued at its usual pace. The summer of 1903 brought more tourists than usual. The main hotel was always full. People came seeking fresh air and the promise of healing that the mountains supposedly offered. But in the evening conversations in the lounges, a new topic began to gain traction. The Ashford sisters, the missing salesman, the rumors that grew like weeds. A journalist from a small city newspaper named Peter Donnelly decided to investigate on his own. He was young, ambitious, and from Charlotte, looking for stories that could launch his career. The disappearance of Thomas Brennan seemed like the kind of case that could yield good articles. Peter started discreetly, talking to people, noting everything in his black notebook. That's how he discovered other disappearances, not all directly linked to the Ashford sisters, but occurring in the same region over the years. In 1899, an itinerant roofer vanished without a trace. In 1900, a woman selling medicinal herbs stopped appearing at the markets. In 1901, a traveling preacher who roamed the mountains never completed his circuit. All these cases had something in common. They were people without strong roots, without families who would make a great fuss over their absences. Peter Donnelly compiled his findings and sought out Sheriff Dalton. The two men spent an entire afternoon comparing information. The picture that emerged was worrying, but still circumstantial. Nothing that could justify stronger legal action. They needed concrete evidence, not just unsettling coincidences. Then an unexpected witness emerged. A 17-year-old farm boy approached the sheriff with a disturbing story. He used to hunt in the woods near the Ashford property. He knew every trail, every stream, every clearing. One full moon night, a few months ago, he was returning late when he heard sounds coming from the twins' property. They weren't normal house sounds. They were like someone digging, metal against stone. Heavy effort. The boy approached cautiously, hidden among the trees. He saw the two sisters in the backyard, illuminated by lanterns. They were digging a large hole, working in absolute silence, moving with a strange synchronicity. He watched long enough to realize that it wasn't the first time they had done this. The surrounding soil showed signs of having been disturbed before in other parts of the property. Frightened, the boy retreated and went back home. He didn't tell anyone because he was afraid. Afraid of his sisters, afraid of being called a liar, afraid of what they might discover if they investigated. But the disappearance of the salesman and the growing rumors in the city made him rethink. Perhaps his silence was protecting something terrible. Sheriff Dalton now had testimony that, though from a young man, was too specific and detailed to ignore. He needed a search warrant. He needed to enter that property and discover exactly what the Ashford sisters were hiding beneath that disturbed soil. But convincing a judge wouldn't be easy. The twins were women of means, technically respectable. They had no criminal record, and accusations based on rumors and indirect testimony might not be enough. While Dalton was preparing his case, something unexpected happened. An anonymous letter arrived at the newspaper office where Peter Donnelly worked. The handwriting was shaky, as if written hastily or by nervous hands. It simply said, "They hold more than secrets, they hold souls. Look in the basement." The anonymous letter caused a whirlwind of speculation. Peter Donnelly immediately took the document to Sheriff Dalton, who examined the paper carefully. It was a common type of stationery, sold in any general store in the area. The ink also revealed nothing special. But the shaky handwriting suggested urgency, perhaps fear. Whoever had written it knew something, but didn't have the courage to identify themselves. Eugene Dalton spent that night sleepless, weighing his options. A search warrant based on an anonymous letter would be difficult to obtain. Judges were cautious, especially when it came to trespassing on the property of respectable citizens. But the phrase "search the basement" was too specific to be just malicious fabrication. Someone knew that house inside and out. Someone had seen something he could no longer keep to himself. The following morning, the sheriff decided to try a different approach. He would return to the Ashford sisters' property, this time accompanied by Peter Donnelly as a representative of the local press. The presence of a journalist might make the twins more cooperative, or at least more careful with their words. It was a risky gamble, but Dalton was running out of options. They set off one July morning when the heat already made the air tremble over the dirt roads. The journey to the property took almost an hour by carriage. The path was even narrower than Dalton remembered, with tree branches intertwining overhead, creating a dark, green tunnel. The closer they got, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Even the birds seemed to sing less in that part of the forest. The house emerged as a dark stain among the trees. It was a sturdy two-story building, with tall, narrow windows that seemed like watchful eyes. The paint was peeling in several places, and vines climbed the side walls like exposed veins. A heavy silence enveloped everything. There were no chickens pecking, no dogs barking, no sign of life common to a rural property. Cordelia answered the door before they even knocked, as if she had been expecting it. She wore a simple, unadorned grey dress, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her eyes scanned the sheriff, and then landed on Peter Donnelly with an intensity that made the journalist swallow hard. She didn't ask the reason for their visit. She simply stood there, blocking the entrance. Dalton introduced the journalist and explained that they would like to ask some additional questions about Thomas Brennan's disappearance. Cordelia didn't move. He said they had already answered everything on the previous visit, that they had nothing to add. Her voice was soft, almost melodious, but there was something about it that recalled the ice of winter. It was then that Marguerite appeared behind her sister. The two were so identical it was unsettling. Same height, same features, same neutral expression that revealed no emotion whatsoever. Marguerite placed her hand on Cordelia's shoulder in a gesture that seemed both protective and possessive. She spoke for the first time, and her voice was exactly like her sister's. She asked if they had a warrant, because otherwise they should leave. Peter Donnelly, trying to gain ground, adopted a more conciliatory tone. He said he was writing an article about road safety in the region, about the dangers travelers faced. He wasn't there to accuse anyone, just to better understand what might have happened to the salesman. The sisters could help clarify the facts, perhaps even dispel the unfair suspicions that had fallen on them. There was a long pause. The twins looked at each other, and in that moment something passed between them. A silent communication that dispensed with words. Finally, Cordelia opened the door a little wider and made an inviting yet cold gesture. They could come in, but only into the living room. The rest of the house was out of the question. The interior was dark and smelled of mildew and something else, something sweet and unpleasant that Peter couldn't identify. The curtains were drawn, allowing only thin slivers of light. The furniture was old and well preserved, but there were few personal items. No family portraits on the walls, no decorative trinkets. It was a house that looked more like a mausoleum than a home. They sat in a cramped room. The sisters stood side by side like soldiers in training. Dalton began with basic questions, reviewing what they already knew. Yes, Thomas Brennan had been there. Yes, he had sold some items. No, he hadn't stayed long. No, he hadn't mentioned where he was going next. The answers alternated between the two, as if they were one person speaking through two mouths. Peter tried a different approach. He asked about the history of the property, about what it was like to live so isolated, if they didn't feel fear or loneliness. Cordelia smiled for the first time, but it was a smile without warmth. She said they preferred solitude to superficial company, that city people were noisy and intrusive, that there, in the forest, they found peace. Marguerite added that they had always been like that, ever since they were little. They preferred each other to anyone outside the family. Their father understood this. Their mother, too. They left them alone, and now that they were alone, they finally had the freedom to live as they wished. There was something deeply unsettling about that speech. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way they were delivered, as if the outside world were a threat, a constant invasion that needed to be repelled. Dalton felt he was facing something he couldn't name, a dynamic that went beyond simple seclusion or eccentricity. Peter asked if he could use the bathroom, a classic excuse to explore the house a bit more. The sisters hesitated. Cordelia said the upstairs bathroom was under renovation. There was an outside latrine in the back if he really needed to. Peter agreed, hoping to have a chance to observe his surroundings. But Marguerite accompanied him to the back door and stood watching, making sure he didn't stray from the path. Outside, Peter could see the yard better. There were several areas where the soil looked different, darker, looser, as if it had been dug up and replaced recently. Some tools were leaning against the wall of the house, including shovels and hoes with remnants of soil still clinging to them. He tried to memorize everything, every detail he could recount later. When she went back inside, she found Sheriff Dalton standing in the hallway, staring at a closed door at the back of the house. It was a heavy, dark wooden door, with a large modern padlock hanging from the lock. Cordelia appeared quickly and positioned herself between Dalton and the door like an animal guarding its territory. She said that was the pantry, where they kept preserves and supplies. They kept it locked because of rats. Dalton asked if he could take a look since he was there. The answer was a firm and definitive no. There was nothing interesting in an ordinary pantry, and they were tired of the visit. It was time for the gentleman to leave. There was no way to insist without causing a direct confrontation. Dalton and Peter said their goodbyes and were escorted to the front door with barely disguised haste. As the door closed behind them, they heard the sound of several locks being activated one after the other. During the return trip, the two men discussed what they had observed. They agreed that there was something deeply wrong in that house. The locked door at the back, the disturbed soil in the yard, the sisters' defensive behavior, everything pointed to secrets they fiercely protected. But they still had no concrete proof of any crime. Peter decided to publish a carefully crafted article in the newspaper, reporting on Thomas Brennan's disappearance and mentioning the difficulties of the investigation. He didn't directly accuse the sisters, but left questions unanswered. The article caused a stir in the town. Families who had previously only whispered now spoke openly. Some defended the Ashfords, saying they were victims of prejudice for being single and independent women. Others demanded a more thorough investigation. The pressure was mounting, and Eugene Dalton knew he needed to act quickly before the case cooled down or the sisters decided to get rid of any evidence that might still exist on that gloomy property. Peter Donnelly's story provoked unexpected reactions. In the following weeks, 3 different people approached the sheriff's office with information they had kept for years, hoping someone would finally pay attention. The first was an elderly woman named Martha Hendricks, who lived about 8 kilometers from the Ashford property. She recounted that in 1899, a few months after the twins' parents died, she heard screams coming from that direction on a moonless night. They were muffled screams, as if someone had their mouth covered, struggling to be heard. She woke her husband, but he said it was just coyotes or the wind in the trees. Martha never forgot that sound. The second testimony came from a former employee of the Ashford family, a middle-aged man named William Garrett. He had worked as a caretaker on the property between 1896 and 1898, taking care of minor repairs and general maintenance. William described Jonathan Ashford as a demanding and cold boss who treated his daughters with a rigidity bordering on cruelty. They could not leave the property without permission. They could not receive visitors. They could not even speak to the servants beyond what was strictly necessary. Elizabeth, the mother, was like a ghost in the house, always with her head down, always silent. But what disturbed William most was the basement. Jonathan never allowed anyone to go down there. He said it was his private space, where he kept important documents and valuables. He kept the door locked with several padlocks. Once, William heard strange sounds coming from down there, as if something heavy was being dragged. When he asked, Jonathan dismissed him immediately, paying only half of what was agreed upon, and threatening him if he spread stories about the family. The third witness was perhaps the most revealing. It was a former neighbor of the Ashfords from when they were still young, a lady named Dorothy Sinclair. She remembered the twins as quiet children, strangely mature for their age. Dorothy lived closer at that time and occasionally saw the girls playing in the yard, but they didn't play like other children. They didn't laugh. They didn't run. They sat side by side, talking quietly to each other, as if plotting constant secrets. Dorothy also mentioned something that had deeply frightened her at the time. She had seen more than once the twins burying small animals in the yard, birds, squirrels, even a cat that belonged to a neighboring family, and had disappeared. When she mentioned it to other people, they said it was just childish curiosity, that many children do strange things. But Dorothy always felt there was something more. The way the girls dug the graves, always the same size, always the same depth, as if they were practicing. Eugene Dalton compiled all these testimonies and presented them to Judge Archibald Morrison, a stern but fair man who had presided over the Buncombe County Court for 15 years. The sheriff argued that there was sufficient circumstantial evidence to justify a thorough search of the Ashford sisters' property. The disappearance of Thomas Brennan, the testimonies about suspicious activities, the anonymous letter mentioning the basement, everything pointed to the need for a more thorough investigation. Judge Morrison read the documents silently, adjusting his glasses several times. Finally, after what seemed like hours, he signed the search warrant, but he imposed conditions. The search should be conducted respectfully, in the presence of impartial witnesses, and any damage to property should be properly documented and compensated if nothing illegal was found. Dalton agreed to everything. He finally had the authorization he needed. The operation was scheduled for a Tuesday in August early in the morning. Dalton gathered 4 deputies, Judge Morrison himself, who insisted on attending, and 2 respectable citizens of the city as neutral witnesses. Peter Donnelly also wanted to go, but the sheriff refused. This wasn't news material, it was police work. If they found anything, the press would be informed at the appropriate time. They set off before dawn, hoping to arrive at the property by daylight. The journey was tense and silent. Each man was lost in his own thoughts about what they might find. Some hoped to discover that it was all a misunderstanding, that the Ashford sisters were merely eccentric and wronged. Others feared confirming their darkest suspicions. The house appeared shrouded in morning mist, looking even more sinister than on previous visits. There was no smoke rising from the chimney, no sign of activity. They knocked on the door several times before Cordelia finally answered. She wore the same type of grey dress, her hair loose this time, falling over her shoulders like a black curtain. Her eyes scanned the group and then fixed on the warrant the sheriff was holding out. She read the document slowly, without haste, while Marguerite appeared beside her. The two exchanged a long look. Then, to everyone's surprise, Cordelia simply opened the door and stepped away, making a gesture of permission with her hand. He said they could search for whatever they wanted, that they had nothing to hide. But there was something in her voice, a note of defiance or perhaps resignation, that made Dalton hesitate for a moment. They entered as a group. Judge Morrison remained in the living room with the sisters, while Dalton and the deputies began a methodical inspection of the house. They started upstairs. The bedrooms were Spartan, almost monastic, beds made with military precision, closets with few clothes, all in dark tones. There was only one room that seemed to be used by the 2 sisters, with 2 beds pushed together. They found nothing suspicious there. They went downstairs and searched the kitchen, the dining room, a small office. Everything was too tidy, too clean, as if real life never touched those rooms. They found some financial documents showing that the sisters lived modestly, making regular purchases but without extravagances. There were old letters from their parents, mostly mundane, talking about weather and harvests. But then they came to the locked door at the back of the house. The one Cordelia had said was a pantry. Dalton asked for the key. There was a pause. Marguerite stood up and went to a small sideboard from which she took a bunch of old keys. She handed them to the sheriff without saying a word, then sat back down beside her sister. The 2 held hands, watching in silence. The key turned in the lock with a metallic click that echoed through the silent house. Dalton pushed the door, which opened with a long, sharp creak. On the other side, there was no pantry. There was a wooden staircase descending into the darkness, the basement. One of the deputies brought a lantern. The dim light revealed steps worn by time, damp stone walls, cobwebs hanging like macabre curtains. The rising air was cold and heavy with that same sweet and unpleasant smell that Peter Donnelly had noticed before, only much more intense. It was a smell that made one's stomach churn, that brought to mind things that shouldn't be thought about. Eugene Dalton went down first, holding the lantern in front of him. The steps groaned under his weight. The temperature dropped with each step. When he reached the bottom, he raised the lamp and looked around. What he saw made his blood run cold. The cellar was larger than I had expected, divided into several sections by stone walls. There were shelves on the walls, but they didn't store preserves or supplies. They kept glass jars with dark liquids, labeled with names and dates. There were also old books, some so old that the covers were falling apart. Dalton picked one up and opened it carefully. It was written in a language he didn't recognize, with strange illustrations and symbols that seemed to belong to some kind of obscure ritual or study. But what really caught his attention was what was in the center of the basement. A large wooden table, stained and marked by time. Around it, chains attached to the walls, and on the floor several dark stains that could be anything. But Dalton knew instinctively what they were. One of the deputies, younger and less experienced, went down behind him and saw the scene. He turned pale and had to run back upstairs. They heard him vomiting outside. Judge Morrison came down next, moving carefully. He also stopped when he saw the basement, adjusting his glasses as if that could change what he was seeing. It was then that they heard a sound coming from one of the side sections of the cellar, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, like a sigh or a muffled groan. Dalton raised the lantern in that direction and walked slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. There was another door there, smaller, almost hidden behind a shelf. It was ajar. Eugene Dalton cautiously pushed open the smaller door. The creaking of the rusty hinges echoed through the basement like a lament. The lantern revealed an even smaller space, a sort of chamber carved into the earth itself. The walls were of rough stone and the floor was packed earth, but what made the sheriff stop was what was leaning against the back wall. She was a person, alive. A man of indeterminate age, dressed in dirty rags, sat with his back against the wall. His hands were tied in front of him with thick ropes, and there was a chain attached to an iron ring fixed to the wall, connected to a shackle on his ankle. He raised his face when the light hit him, blinking as if he hadn't seen light in a long time. His hair and beard were long and tangled. His skin was as pale as wax. Dalton approached slowly, kneeling beside the man. He asked who he was and how long he had been there. The man tried to speak, but his voice came out only as a hoarse, almost inaudible whisper. He was clearly dehydrated and weak. Judge Morrison, still in the doorway, ordered that water be brought immediately. One of the deputies ran upstairs. Meanwhile, Dalton examined the restraints. They were firm, but not tight enough to cause injury. There was a bucket in the corner of the chamber and some leftover food on a metal plate. Whoever that man was, the sisters were keeping him alive, feeding him minimally. But why? And for how long? The water arrived and the man drank eagerly, coughing between sips. Gradually, his voice began to return. He said his name was Henry Carver. He was an itinerant worker, repairing roofs and barns. He had arrived at the Ashford estate in March of that year, offering his services. The sisters invited him in and served him tea. After that, he only remembered waking up down here, chained up. Henry didn't know how much time had passed. In the constant darkness, without seeing the sun, the days lost their meaning. The sisters came down once a day, always together, bringing food and water. They never said anything. They only looked at him with those cold, expressionless eyes, checked their chains and went back up again. He tried to shout in the first few days, but no one heard him. The property was too isolated. The sheriff ordered them to cut the ropes and remove the handcuffs. Henry could barely stand, his legs weak from months of immobility. 2 deputies helped him up the stairs, step by step. When they reached the ground floor, the daylight temporarily blinded him. He covered his eyes with trembling hands. The Ashford sisters remained seated in the room, still holding hands, observing everything with a disturbing calm. They showed no surprise, tried not to flee, offered no explanations. They simply stood there, like statues of black marble. Judge Morrison, regaining his composure after the initial shock, addressed them in a controlled but firm voice. He asked what this meant, why they were keeping a man imprisoned in their basement. Cordelia looked at him for a long moment before answering. Her voice remained soft, almost gentle, which made her words all the more disturbing. She said they had no choice, that it was necessary, that it had always been necessary. Marguerite continued where her sister had left off, as if they were completing each other's thoughts. She said that their father had taught them that it was the only way to maintain balance, to repay the debt, to prevent something worse from happening. No one understood what that meant. Dalton asked what debt, what balance, what they were talking about, but the twins fell silent. They simply turned their faces to each other and said nothing more. It was as if they had decided simultaneously that the conversation was over. The sheriff had no choice but to arrest them. He handcuffed both of them, and they offered no resistance. They were led to the carriage with the same passivity with which they did everything. They sat side by side on the seat, their handcuffed hands meeting in the middle. During the entire journey back to Asheville, they didn't say a single word. Henry Carver was taken to the town doctor, Dr. Whitfield, the same doctor who had signed the death certificates of the Ashford sisters' parents. The doctor examined the man carefully. Aside from malnutrition and muscle weakness, Henry was surprisingly well. There were no signs of physical violence, no serious injuries. It seemed the sisters had simply kept him imprisoned, nothing more. But the psychological trauma was evident. Henry trembled constantly and was afraid to close his eyes. Meanwhile, other deputies continued the investigation at the property. The basement was thoroughly examined. The bottles on the shelves contained liquids that appeared to be tinctures or plant extracts, some clearly poisonous. The books were old treatises on folk medicine, occultism, and practices that the church would consider heretical. There were also diaries written by Jonathan Ashford, the twins' father. One of the deputies brought the diaries to Eugene Dalton, who began reading them that very night. The earliest entries were from 1876. Shortly after Jonathan had settled in the region, he wrote about his arrival in Kentucky, about having found something in the mountains. He didn't specify what, but spoke vaguely about forbidden knowledge, about secrets that certain places hold. He said he had made a deal, that he received wealth in exchange for a promise. The promise was to feed something, not with food, but with human presence, with life kept in captivity. Jonathan wrote that he didn't fully understand the mechanism, but that it worked. As long as he kept someone imprisoned in that cellar, his fortune would continue, his family would be protected from misfortune, and whatever dwelt in the depths of the earth would remain dormant. He had brought this practice with him to North Carolina. He had built the house specifically with that basement. Over the years he kept several captives down there, never for very long, a few months at most. Then he would release them in distant places, with enough money to start over and under terrible threats if they talked. Most fled west and were never seen again, but there were mentions of those who tried to resist or who did not survive captivity. Jonathan wrote about having to bury them in the backyard, always at night, always in deep graves. He did this with regret. He said, but it was necessary. The agreement demanded compliance. Any failure would bring terrible consequences. The most recent entries from 1897 and 1898 showed Jonathan increasingly obsessed and disturbed. He mentioned that he was teaching his daughters, that they needed to know, needed to continue after his death, that the agreement did not end with him. It passed from generation to generation. Cordelia and Marguerite were his heirs in every sense. The last entry was from January 1898, a few weeks before his death. Jonathan wrote that he was ill, that he felt the end approaching. He feared that Elizabeth would not be strong enough to maintain the tradition. But the twins would. They understood. They were different. They would do whatever was necessary. Eugene Dalton closed the diary with trembling hands. He was dealing with something that went far beyond a simple crime. This was a madness passed down from father to daughters, a delusional belief that had shaped decades of criminal behavior. But was it just madness, or was there something more? He returned to the basement the following morning, accompanied by men who began digging in the earthen floor where the stains were most visible. It didn't take them long to find something. Bones, human bones, buried in shallow graves, some so old they almost crumbled to the touch. They counted at least 6 sets of remains, possibly more. The news spread through Asheville like wildfire. The Ashford sisters' case became the only topic of conversation in the streets, markets, and churches. Newspapers from larger cities sent reporters. Peter Donnelly wrote daily articles trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. The twins were held in the small-town jail, in separate cells for the first time in their lives. They didn't eat, they didn't sleep, they just sat on their bunks, staring at the walls. The guards reported that sometimes they whispered, as if they were talking to each other through the walls that separated them. The trial was scheduled for October of that year. It would be the biggest criminal case North Carolina had ever seen. The months leading up to the trial were marked by growing tension in Asheville. The city had never experienced anything of this magnitude. Reporters arrived from Richmond, Atlanta, and even New York. The small hotel was packed, and local families began renting rooms to visitors. The taverns teemed with heated discussions about the Ashford sisters, about what should happen to them, about whether they were monsters or victims of a distorted upbringing. The twins' defense was taken on by a lawyer from Charlotte named Edmund Price. He was a 50-year-old man, a veteran of difficult cases, known for his ability to find legal loopholes and appeal to the jury's sympathy. When he first visited his clients in prison, he expected to find terrified or remorseful women. Instead, he found Cordelia and Marguerite sitting in their cells, calm as always, as if it were all just a temporary inconvenience. Price tried to speak to them separately, but both refused to talk unless they were together. Eventually, Sheriff Dalton allowed a joint meeting in the visiting room, with guards present. It was there that the lawyer first heard the complete story, told in turns by the sisters, each completing the other's sentences. They spoke of their isolated childhood, of their father who raised them with extreme strictness. Jonathan wasn't cruel in a physical sense. He never hit or hurt them, but he constantly shaped their minds, teaching them that they were special, different from ordinary people, that they carried an ancestral responsibility, a duty that transcended human laws. From a young age, they were taken to the hold. Jonathan made them watch when he brought in the captives. He explained that this was necessary to maintain the natural order of things, to prevent ancient and hungry forces from emerging from the depths of the earth. He said that those lands, since before the colonists, since even before the native peoples, held something that needed to be appeased. Cordelia and Marguerite didn't question anything. They were just children, and Jonathan was their whole world. Their mother, Elizabeth, was too weak to protect them or to question her husband. She herself had lived under his control for so long that she had lost any will of her own. When she finally died, it was almost a relief, and when Jonathan followed them weeks later, the twins felt no sadness. They felt freedom, but freedom came with obligation. They genuinely believed in what their father had taught them. They believed that if they didn't keep someone in the cellar, something terrible would happen. In the first years after Jonathan's death, they tried to continue exactly as he had done. They captured lone travelers, kept them for a few months, then released them far away. But something changed. Perhaps it was the growing suspicion of the neighbors. Perhaps it was the fear of being discovered. They began to keep the captives for longer periods. Thomas Brennan was not the first. There were others before him who eventually languished in the basement. When that happened, the sisters buried them in the yard, as their father had taught them. Always with silent ceremonies, always asking for forgiveness, but always believing it was necessary. Edmund Price listened to all this with a mixture of horror and fascination. He asked if they understood that it was wrong, that they had taken away the freedom and possibly the lives of innocent people. The twins looked at him with those dark, expressionless eyes. Cordelia replied that they understood what the law said, but that there were older, deeper laws that society had forgotten, but that remained in effect. The lawyer realized he had an insanity case on his hands. No jury would believe that story of ancient forces and supernatural agreements. But perhaps he could convince them that the sisters had been so deeply manipulated by their father since childhood that they couldn't be considered fully responsible for their actions. They were victims as much as criminals. Meanwhile, the prosecution was preparing its case with unwavering determination. The public prosecutor, named Samuel Hutchins, was methodical. He didn't care about stories of madness or psychological manipulation. There was concrete evidence that the Ashford sisters had held people captive, that there were human remains buried on their property, that serious crimes had been committed. The law was clear as to what should happen. Henry Carver, the man rescued from the basement, became the key witness. He was slowly recovering, gaining weight and strength, but the psychological scars would remain forever. He had nightmares every night, waking up screaming. He couldn't stay in enclosed or dark places. The doctor who was treating him said he would probably never fully recover. Others also came forward. People who had had brief encounters with the sisters over the years and who now realized how close they had been to danger. A blacksmith remembered how Cordelia had looked at him strangely when he repaired a lock on the property in 1901. A seamstress recalled delivering dresses there and feeling an oppressive atmosphere, as if the house itself breathed fear. The trial began on a cold Monday in October. The Buncombe County Courthouse had never been so full. People arrived hours early to secure seats in the galleries. Outside, a crowd gathered, waiting for news. Some carried banners demanding justice. Others, surprisingly, defended the sisters as victims of a tyrannical father. When Cordelia and Marguerite were brought into the courtroom, an absolute silence fell over everyone. They wore simple dark dresses, their hair tied back. They walked side by side, their steps perfectly synchronized. They sat in the dock without looking at the audience, keeping their eyes fixed ahead. Judge Morrison, the same judge who had authorized the search, presided over the case. He established strict rules of order. Any disturbance would be punished with immediate expulsion. This was a court of law, not a public spectacle. The prosecution presented its case first. Samuel Hutchins was eloquent and direct. He showed photos of the property, the basement, the chains. He called Henry Carver to the witness stand. The man was still thin and pale, visibly trembling as he described the months he spent in the dark, chained, not knowing if he would live to see the sun again. Hutchins also presented Jonathan Ashford's diaries, reading excerpts aloud. The courtroom listened in morbid silence as the words of a dead man revealed decades of hidden crimes. The prosecutor argued that the sisters, now grown women, had consciously chosen to continue their father's actions. They were not innocent children. They were criminals who needed to answer for their actions. Edmund Price's defense took a different approach. He didn't deny the facts. He couldn't. The evidence was irrefutable. Instead, he focused on the psychology of the accused. He called experts who testified about the effects of prolonged manipulation since childhood. He explained how a person raised in total isolation, constantly taught that certain beliefs were absolute truths, could lose the ability to distinguish right from wrong. Price argued that Cordelia and Marguerite never had a chance to develop a normal moral conscience. They were like automatons, programmed by their father to perform a specific function. They didn't really understand what they were doing because they were never allowed to. They deserved medical treatment, not punishment. It was a clever defense, but it faced a huge obstacle. The jury was composed of 12 men from the region, family men, honest workers. For them, the psychological subtleties mattered less than the simple and brutal fact that people had suffered and died on that property. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when the twins themselves were called to testify. Edmund Price had prepared them, rehearsed what they should say, but when Cordelia took the witness stand, it became clear that she would follow her own path. She spoke in a clear, calm voice. She confirmed everything the prosecution had presented. Yes, they kept people in the basement. Yes, some died. Yes, they buried the bodies in the backyard. She said all this without showing remorse or emotion, simply stating the facts. When Hutchins asked why they had done that, Cordelia looked directly at him. She replied that it was necessary, that the agreement needed to be upheld, that if they didn't, something worse would happen. Hutchins asked, "What worse thing?" Cordelia simply said that he didn't want to know, that nobody wanted to know, that it was better for everyone if some doors remained closed. It was an answer that sent shivers down the spine, not because it made sense, but because she absolutely believed what she was saying. It wasn't a lie or an act. It was a deep and unwavering conviction. Marguerite then testified and repeated almost exactly the same words as her sister. It was like hearing echoes, two voices saying the same thing in slightly different ways. The effect was profoundly disturbing. The trial lasted 2 weeks. In the end, the jury retired to deliberate. The jury's deliberation lasted 4 full days. Those were days of unbearable tension in Asheville. People gathered in groups on street corners, speculating about the verdict. Some bet on a full conviction, others believed the defense had planted enough seeds of doubt about the sisters' sanity. Peter Donnelly published daily special editions of the newspaper, keeping the public informed of every detail. Inside the deliberation room, the 12 jurors faced a genuine dilemma. The evidence of the crimes was irrefutable, but the question of mental responsibility was more complex than they had imagined. They were not psychologists or philosophers. They were practical men trying to decide on something that challenged their common understanding of human nature. Some jurors argued that insanity was no excuse for such serious crimes. Others insisted that people raised like Cordelia and Marguerite could not be judged by the same standards as someone with a normal education and experiences. The discussions stretched for hours, sometimes becoming heated, but always returned to the same central question. Did the Ashford sisters know they were doing something wrong? On the 4th day, they finally reached a consensus. The court bell rang, calling everyone back. The room filled within minutes. Judge Morrison took his seat. The sisters were brought in and sat together as always, their hands discreetly touching. The jury spokesman, a respected businessman named Arthur Patterson, stood up. His voice trembled slightly as he read the verdict. Guilty on all counts: kidnapping, false imprisonment, murder. The room erupted in mixed reactions. Some applauded, others wept. Many simply stood silent, processing the weight of that moment. Cordelia and Marguerite did not react. They showed no surprise or fear. They simply remained seated, looking ahead with the same neutral expression they had maintained from the beginning. It was as if the verdict was irrelevant to them, as if it were beyond human judgment. Judge Morrison set the sentencing for the following week, but everyone already knew what it would be. North Carolina had clear laws for crimes of this nature. There was only one possible punishment for multiple premeditated murders. The night after the verdict, Eugene Dalton visited the sisters in prison. It wasn't part of his job. He had no official reason to be there, but something compelled him to try to understand one last time who these women were. He found them in their separate cells, each lying on her bunk, staring at the ceiling. Dalton pulled up a chair and sat down in the hallway between the 2 cells. He asked if they had any regrets, any desire to better explain their actions. Cordelia turned her head to look at him. She asked if he really wanted to know the truth or if he was just seeking comfort in a conventional confession. The sheriff said he wanted the truth. Cordelia then recounted something she hadn't mentioned at the trial. She said that when they were little, their father would take them to the basement on specific nights, always on a new moon, always when the silence was deepest. He would turn off all the lights and make them stand still, listening, and they would listen. Something stirred in the depths beyond the foundation of the house. It wasn't rats or the wind. It was something bigger, something that breathed with a slow ancient rhythm. Jonathan said it had been there since before the mountains took their current form, since before any human memory existed, and it needed to be kept dormant. Marguerite continued the story from her cell. She said that when her father died and they were left alone, they thought about stopping. They tried, in fact. For a few weeks, they left the cellar empty, and then the dreams began. Dreams where they woke up on the dirt floor, surrounded by absolute darkness, feeling something immense approaching. They woke up screaming, covered in cold sweat, and the dreams worsened each night that the cellar remained empty. They succumbed to fear. They captured someone, kept them in the basement, and the dreams stopped. This became their cycle. Prisoner, relief, liberation, dreams, new prisoner. It wasn't cruelty for the pleasure of being cruel. It was fear. Fear of something they couldn't explain to anyone because no one would believe them. Dalton listened to all of this and asked the obvious question, if it was just about keeping someone imprisoned, why did some die? Why not simply release them in time? Cordelia lowered her eyes for the first time. She said that sometimes they miscalculated. Sometimes they underestimated how long the person could hold out, and when they realized it, it was already too late. It was a cold confession of negligence that resulted in death. It didn't make things any better. It possibly made them worse. Dalton left prison that night feeling more disturbed than before. There was no redemption in that story. No moment of enlightenment where everything made sense. Just two women trapped in a delusional belief that justified terrible crimes. The sentence came the following Monday. Judge Morrison was brief and direct. He condemned Cordelia and Marguerite Ashford to death by hanging, to be carried out in 30 days. The date was set for the 15th day of November 1903. The sisters heard the sentence without visible reaction. They were taken back to their cells, where they would remain until the appointed day. Those last few weeks were strange. The city of Asheville entered a state of morbid waiting. Some saw the execution as necessary justice. Others felt discomfort at the idea of hanging two women, no matter how serious their crimes. Reverend Pritchard visited the sisters several times, trying to offer spiritual comfort, but they refused any talk of salvation or repentance. Edmund Price attempted legal recourse, appealing to higher courts, and again arguing insanity. But the appeals were denied one after another. The law had run its course. The verdict was final. On the eve of the execution, something unexpected happened. Peter Donnelly managed to secure a final interview with the sisters, the first time the press had had direct access to them since their conviction. He was allowed to spend an hour with each of them separately. He brought his notebook and pen, prepared to record their last words. Cordelia spoke about her childhood more openly than ever before. She described the isolated house as a prison, but a prison they ended up loving because it was all they knew. She spoke of her mother, Elizabeth, as a ghostly figure who silently warned them with sad looks, but never found the courage to intervene. And she spoke of her father as someone who genuinely believed he was protecting the world from something terrible. Marguerite, in turn, spoke about her twin sister. She said that she had never, in her entire life, felt alone because she had always had Cordelia, that they were more than sisters, they were two parts of the same being, and that the only thing that frightened her about death was not the end itself, but the possibility of being separated even after it. Peter asked if they had any final message for the world, anything they wanted people to know. Cordelia thought for a long moment. Then he said that people should be more careful about what they bury, that sometimes secrets kept in the dark have a reason for being there, that not everything that is discovered should be brought to light. It was a cryptic and disturbing message. Peter Donnelly wasn't sure what to do with it. He published the interview in the morning edition of the day of the execution, causing a final wave of speculation and debate. Some interpreted it as an admission of more undiscovered crimes, others as the final delirium of disturbed minds. The dawn of November 15th brought grey skies and the threat of rain. A crowd of hundreds gathered around the courthouse, where the gallows had been erected in the inner courtyard. Public executions were still common at that time, seen as necessary demonstrations of justice. But there was something deeply unsettling about this particular one. The sisters were brought at 7 in the morning. They wore simple white cotton dresses, their hair loose for the first time in public. They walked together towards the gallows with the same calm they displayed in everything. They did not cry, they did not tremble, they did not beg for mercy. They climbed the wooden steps side by side. The executioner offered blindfolds to cover their eyes. Both refused. They wanted to see. Cordelia looked at the assembled crowd and said something in a low voice, which only Marguerite and the executioner heard. No one ever knew exactly what it was, but the executioner was visibly disturbed. The ribbons were placed. Reverend Pritchard offered a final prayer, which they ignored. Instead, the sisters looked at each other and smiled. It was the first genuine smile anyone had ever seen on them, a smile that seemed to share a secret no one else could understand. The trapdoor opened at 7:13 a.m. It was quick. The doctor present confirmed that both had died within minutes. The bodies were left hanging for the time stipulated by law, then lowered and prepared for burial. There was no public wake. There was no religious ceremony. The Ashford sisters were buried in the county cemetery, in separate graves as legally required, although many found it cruel to separate them even in death. But the end of the twins' lives did not mark the end of the story. In fact, it was only the beginning of something even stranger. In the days following the execution, Eugene Dalton ordered a thorough examination of the Ashford property. Teams of workers were sent to excavate the entire yard, searching for more evidence of hidden crimes. They found 3 more sets of human remains buried in areas that had not been previously investigated. Each discovery confirmed what was already suspected. The sisters had maintained this practice for years, perhaps since the moment they were left alone after their parents' death. The house itself became an object of morbid curiosity. People began to show up, wanting to see up close the place where so many horrors had occurred. The sheriff had to put guards in place to prevent trespassing, but even so, at night, some adventurers tried to enter, seeking souvenirs or simply the thrill of being in a place so laden with dark history. It was during one of these nightly patrols that something inexplicable happened. One of the guards, a young congressman named Marcus Webb, was making his rounds around the property when he heard sounds coming from inside the house. They were footsteps, slow, rhythmic, as if 2 people were walking side by side through the empty hallways. Marcus called for reinforcements and they entered together, weapons drawn. They found no one. The house was empty, locked inside and out. Nothing had been touched, but the sound of footsteps continued for a few minutes before ceasing completely. The men left, pale and nervous. Marcus swore he would never return to that place, no matter how much they paid. Other strange occurrences were reported. Distant neighbors said they saw lights in the house's windows at night, as if someone were walking with candles through the dark rooms. Hunters who passed near the property spoke of an oppressive feeling, of being watched by invisible eyes. Some swore they heard whispers coming from the ground, as if buried voices were trying to reach the surface. Peter Donnelly, always on the lookout for the next story, decided to spend an entire night at the property to verify these reports. He brought along another journalist and some flashlights. They settled into the living room, determined to document any unusual phenomena. The first few hours were quiet. After midnight, however, the temperature began to drop drastically, even though it was a mild November night. They then heard what Marcus Webb had described. Footsteps, clear and distinct, coming from upstairs. 2 sets of footsteps, perfectly synchronized. Peter climbed the stairs, his heart pounding, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The rooms were empty, but in one of them, the one the twins had shared, the 2 beds that were pushed together had recent marks on the mattresses as if someone had just gotten out of them. It wasn't settled dust. It was fresh depressions. Peter touched one and felt heat. Impossible but real. He and his colleague ran out of the house and didn't stop until they were back in town. The article Peter wrote afterward was his most controversial. Half the readers thought he was making it up to sell newspapers. The other half believed him and completely avoided that area of the mountains. Judge Morrison, practical as always, decided that the best solution was to demolish the house. If it was causing so much commotion and fear, it was best to eliminate it completely. A team of workers was hired in December to begin the demolition, but they encountered unexpected difficulties. The tools broke with unusual frequency. Wood that should have easily given way resisted as if it were stone. The workers reported constant discomfort, headaches and nausea. 2 of them simply abandoned the job without explanation, leaving their tools behind. The foreman, an experienced man who had already demolished dozens of structures, said he had never encountered a house that seemed to refuse to be destroyed. Finally, they decided to burn it down. It was more efficient. On an afternoon in January 1904, they set fire to the structure. The flames quickly consumed the house, turning decades of history into ashes. The crowd that watched from a safe distance reported something curious. As the fire intensified, some swore they saw 2 silhouettes in the second-floor windows. standing side by side, watching. When the flames reached that level, the figures simply disappeared. The cellar, being made of stone, partially survived the fire. Eugene Dalton ordered it to be filled with earth and stones, sealing it permanently. Workers dumped entire cartloads of rubble until no empty space remained. Then they planted trees on the site, attempting to return that land to nature. But the stories persisted. Over the following months, people continued to report strange experiences in that area. One farmer who bought part of the land, intending to cultivate it, discovered that nothing grew there. The seeds germinated, but the plants withered before producing anything. He ended up abandoning the land. A family that had considered building a new house on the site changed their minds after the wife had recurring dreams about two dark-haired women watching her from afar, always together, always silent. The dreams were so disturbing that she absolutely refused to return there. In 1907, 3 years after the events, a researcher of unusual phenomena from Boston came to Asheville to investigate. His name was Theodore Blackwell, and he had documented several cases of alleged hauntings along the East Coast. Theodore spent weeks interviewing witnesses, reviewing records, and visiting the site where the house had once stood. His findings were published in a small journal dedicated to the study of the unusual. He argued that, regardless of whether we believe in supernatural manifestations or not, something had clearly affected the collective psychology of that region. The Ashford sisters, through their actions and beliefs, had created a scar on the local consciousness that continued to bleed even after their deaths. Theodore also examined Jonathan Ashford's diaries more thoroughly than the police had. He discovered references to even older texts, mentions of practices dating back to the first settlers of the Appalachian Mountains, and even to the native peoples who inhabited the region before them. There was a tradition, he said, of cursed or marked places where the land demanded specific tributes to remain at peace. Of course, these ideas were rejected by most as superstition and fantasy, but Theodore Blackwell wasn't trying to prove the existence of supernatural forces. He was documenting how certain beliefs, passed down through generations, could shape behavior and create psychological realities as powerful as any physical truth. What happened to that property in the following years only reinforced his theory. The land remained abandoned. No one wanted to buy it, no matter how low the price. It became a place people avoided, an empty hole on the map of the region. The trees planted on the old cellar grew, but in a twisted way, their branches bending at strange angles as if trying to escape from something buried below. Eugene Dalton, who remained sheriff for another decade, never spoke publicly about the case after the trial. But those close to him noticed changes. He became more introspective, more cautious. When young deputies joked about the haunted house or the ghost twins, he silenced them with a stern look. There were things, he said, that were better left unassumed, even if we didn't understand them. Peter Donnelly eventually left Asheville, moving to a larger city where he found work at a more prominent newspaper, but he kept all his notebooks about the Ashford case, storing them in a locked box in his office. Years later, when his son asked about them, Peter simply said they were mementos from a time when he learned that some stories are too weighty to be carried lightly. Henry Carver, the man rescued from the basement, never fully recovered. He tried to rebuild his life, but the months in the dark had scarred him deeply. He moved to Tennessee, far from the mountains of North Carolina, seeking a new beginning. But he carried with him nightmares and a constant fear of enclosed spaces. He died in 1911, at only 42 years old. Those who knew him said he aged decades in just a few years, as if the time stolen in the basement took its toll even after his liberation. Ashford Estate entered local folklore as a cautionary tale. Mothers used the story to frighten disobedient children. Young people turned it into dares of courage, though few actually dared to approach the place at night. And as the years passed, the story grew, acquiring layers of embellishment and exaggeration that obscured the real facts beneath myths and legends. But for those who lived through the events, who witnessed the trial, who saw the Ashford sisters walk to the gallows with that unsettling calm, the story remained crystal clear in their memories. They didn't need exaggeration or ghosts. The reality was terrifying enough. Over the years, the Ashford sisters case has become something bigger than the facts allowed. In 1920, a sensationalist writer published a book about the case, adding elements that never existed, creating invented dialogues, and attributing supernatural powers to the twins that no witness ever mentioned. The book sold well, especially outside of North Carolina, where people didn't know the true story and preferred the romanticized and frightening version. This deeply angered those who had lived through the actual events. The elderly Reverend Pritchard wrote a letter to the editor protesting the distortions. He reminded people that behind the whole story there were real victims, men and women who suffered and died, families who never discovered what happened to their loved ones until the bodies were found in that cursed yard. In 1925, the area where the Ashford property was located was finally incorporated into a state forest reserve. The decision was practical, not symbolic. Nobody wanted that land, so the state absorbed it. Signs were put up marking trails for hikers, but none mentioned what had happened there decades before. It was as if they were trying to erase that history from the local geography. But nature has its own memory. Forest rangers who worked in the area over the years consistently reported that that particular section of the forest was different, quieter. Animals avoided the spot where the house had once stood. Birds didn't nest in the gnarled trees that grew over the old basement. Deer passed around never through. It was as if the wildlife itself recognized that something was wrong with that patch of land. In 1935, an anthropology student at the University of North Carolina chose the Ashford case as the subject of his thesis. He approached the story from an academic angle, examining how folkloric beliefs and social isolation can create systems of thought completely disconnected from shared reality. He interviewed survivors from that time, now elderly, and compiled a more balanced narrative than had been done before. What he discovered was fascinating. The Ashford sisters weren't the only ones in the Appalachian region to hold strange beliefs about the land. There was a whole tradition, maintained in isolated communities, about marked places, about debts that needed to be paid, about agreements with forces that predated the arrival of European settlers. Jonathan Ashford had simply taken these beliefs to a terrible and criminal extreme. The student argued that although the crimes were real and inexcusable, understanding them required looking beyond individual evil. It was necessary to examine how isolated cultures develop their own logics, their own truths, which may seem insane to those who live outside them, but are perfectly coherent to those who grow up immersed in them. The thesis was never widely read outside of academic circles, but it offered perhaps the most balanced and compassionate analysis of the case ever made. It did not absolve the sisters, but it humanized them in a way that the 1903 court failed to do. During World War II, when so many young men from Asheville went to serve overseas, the Ashford case became one of those stories soldiers told each other in the trenches, a story from home, but distorted by distance and time into something almost mythical. The twins became witches. The basement became a portal to another world. The property became a place cursed by ancient peoples. Each narrator added details, and the real story became increasingly buried under layers of fiction. In the 1950s and 1960s, with the rise of horror culture in popular media, the Ashford case was rediscovered by writers and filmmakers. Several adaptations were proposed, some even filmed as sensationalist documentaries. Asheville, trying to reinvent itself as a tourist destination, didn't know how to handle this attention. Part of the population wanted to commercially exploit the story. Another part wanted to forget it completely. In 1973, the last direct survivor of the 1903 events passed away. He was the son of one of the deputies who had participated in the search of the property. With his death, the last living connection to those days disappeared. The story officially became historical, no longer part of the community's living memory. The site where the property once stood remains part of the forest reserve to this day. Trails pass nearby but not directly over it. Hikers occasionally get lost and end up in that clearing where trees grow in strange shapes. Most don't know where they are. Some feel uneasy, a sense that they shouldn't be there, and move on quickly. Very few know the full story of what that land hides. Official records concerning the Ashford case are archived in the Buncombe County Courthouse. They consist of pages yellowed with age, faded photographs and testimonies written in old handwriting. Researchers occasionally consult them, but interest is sporadic. The story has become obscure, known mainly to enthusiasts of historical criminal cases or scholars of the Appalachian region. But for those who delve into these archives, who read the original testimonies and examine the documented evidence, a disturbing truth emerges. There is no simple explanation. There is no moment of revelation where everything makes sense. Only the complex and uncomfortable reality that human beings are capable of extraordinarily disturbing things when raised in isolation, fed distorted beliefs, and deprived of any contact with alternative perspectives. Cordelia and Marguerite Ashford were criminals. That is undeniable. They held people captive, caused immense suffering, and took lives. But they were also victims. Victims of a father who molded their minds from childhood, who deprived them of any chance to develop their own moral sense, who turned them into instruments of his own sick obsessions. The question that remains more than a century later is not whether they were guilty. They were. The question is what we do with stories like these. How do we remember without sensationalizing? How do we understand without excusing? How do we learn without turning real tragedies into cheap entertainment? The Ashford sisters' case reminds us that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural. They are human. They are created through generations of dysfunction, isolation, and toxic beliefs passed down from parent to child, like poisonous inheritances. It reminds us that evil is rarely simple, that behind every horrific crime lies a complex web of causes and consequences that defy easy judgments. And it reminds us, perhaps more importantly, that some secrets carry weight, that there are stories that shouldn't be forgotten, not because they are frightening, but because they are true, because they teach us about the limits of human nature, about what happens when we allow isolation and ignorance to create their own systems of reality. The Appalachian Mountains still hold that history in their soil. Trees grow over what was once the cellar. The wind still blows through the twisted branches, and every now and then, someone stumbles into that clearing and feels the weight of decades of suffering ingrained in the earth beneath their feet, without knowing exactly why. If you've made it this far on this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in Appalachian history, thank you for staying with me until the end. These stories are difficult to tell and difficult to hear, but important to remember. If you enjoyed this content, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. Leave a like if you found the account interesting, and comment on what